we're good to go. You're awesome.
Thanks, Christina. Hello and welcome, everyone. Thank you for being here today. I just want to welcome you on behalf of the LA Capacity Builders Network and personally from TNP. We just want to welcome you and thank you for joining us today. We have invited Cal Nonprofit CEO Jan Masaoka to share new insights and data from the 2019 Causes Counts report on the nonprofit sector in California, and also she'll be sharing local data on LA County nonprofits. She'll also be sharing some information about the current state of the sector and recommendations for what nonprofits can be doing now and moving forward. And with so much going on, we know that advocacy is so important in what we do. So we're really happy that we're able to have this conversation today. Cal Nonprofits plays an important role in that advocacy for all of us. They've helped us individually and as the Capacity Builder Network, spending time with us on calls and talking about what we could do to help our sector. So we want to thank you, Jan, and thank the team for your continued work. Before we get started, I want to invite David Factor, the CEO of Executive Service Corps Southern California, to say a few words about the Capacity Builders Network and share a little more about that. So, David?
Thanks, Michelle. Hi, everybody out there in TV land, I suppose. First, I have to thank Michelle and the folks at the Nonprofit Partnership for putting this together logistically and reaching out to Jan and the like. Really love working with you. You guys are outstanding. And for those who logged on and Christina, I think either as a DJ or a radio host, there's alternatives for you, although Michelle will never want you to leave what she's doing or what you're doing with her. So I just want to thank you all. And Jan, thank you for being here. Although we didn't get you down to enjoy Long Beach, so you're still up there in the fog in the north. I'm so looking forward to your information and the wisdom you'll share with us today, as you always do. I'm one of the coordinators, I suppose, of the Capacity Builders Network and get to work with Michelle and a few others really closely on that. We are a network of about 18 nonprofit organizations that have come together since about 2010 to maximize our effectiveness by sharing our knowledge, tools, resources, support, to work together as well as individually, specifically to improve the capacity of our region's nonprofit organizations. Collectively and individually, we help them make the most efficient, most effective use of their own people, money, and programs to serve their missions. And those of you who've heard me talk know that I believe every single nonprofit is doing something truly important, truly critical, and we are entrusted and honored as organizations and individuals to be working to support your important work to help the lives of our people in our region. All of us offer different approaches and resources to help nonprofits, no matter what the stage, no matter what the challenge of your evolution is. And obviously today is a particularly challenging time. And we are here for you as nonprofits ourselves. We have maybe a deeper personal stake and understanding in what you're going through. So I hope that you'll tap into our passion, our skills, our knowledge, and our energy to help you. I know there's a directory link both with the flyer as well as in the chat box. And I hope you will reach out to any of us and explore whether or not we can help. We're here for you and love what we do in that way. And if you want to either connect with myself or Michelle to help you figure out which of this Capacity Builder Network organizations might be particularly suited to help you, we're happy to do it. But again, we are here for you and wish you continued excellence in all that you do to help our region. And with that, now we get to the meat of the program. Back to Michelle and Jan. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, David. It's true. And I'll go ahead and share our emails up in the chat as well, just so that we definitely can help navigate the supports that are out there for you. But we are here for you, and we do understand as nonprofits what you are all going through at some level. So thank you, David, for sharing all of that. we're happy to be partners with all of you. So now I want to just set a reminder before I introduce Jan and a little bit about Cal Nonprofits and Jan. This is a webinar function because of the amount of people on the call, but we do want it open to dialogue as well as questions. So if you have any comments on information that Jan is sharing, any disagreements, any points you want to make, or if you do have questions or clarifying questions, or questions to start a discussion, please feel free to share those either in the chat or the Q&A function, whatever's easier for you on whatever device you're on. But we do want, as much as we can in a webinar format, to encourage that dialogue too. I know Jan will share that again when she gets started, but we want to make sure that we're open to all of that and to let you all know as well. So now I would love to introduce Jan. Jan Masaoka is the CEO of Cal Nonprofits. Cal Nonprofits, again, it's a statewide policy alliance and really the voice for California's nonprofit community. Cal Nonprofits is an effective advocate in Sacramento. There's over 10,000 members covering 57, maybe 58 now, Jan will hear, of the counties in California. And Jan is also a writer, researcher, speaker, has the focus on nonprofit business planning, boards of directors, and the roles of nonprofits. And we really appreciate all she and the organization has done, and also for being here today. So with that, Jan, the virtual floor is all yours.
Thanks, Michelle. Thanks, David. You know, not everybody, I know that the nonprofit partnership reaches people way beyond Long Beach, but I do want to say to those of you in Long Beach, you may think that there are organizations in every city like the nonprofit partnership, and there aren't. So I hope that you appreciate them. I don't know what that actually means, you know, kind of emanate good things in their direction. But I just want to make sure that you appreciate that. And I also really liked Michelle's comment that please type in the chat box or in the Q&A box either questions or comments like that's the stupidest thing I've ever heard or anything like that will make this more interesting to everybody. And you know, I'm a longtime fan of ESC consultants. On another job, we shared an office for several years with ESC of San Francisco, so I'm very familiar with ESC. So I'm going to launch onto this slideshow, and let's hope that this all works the way it's supposed to. Okay, hoping you're all seeing this. All right, so you all have seen a million economic impact studies, right? There's always another one, an impact of the port or of the stadium or of a school or which way the new sewer line is going to go. And it's really interesting that until a few years ago, when we did this, there had never been an economic impact study of California's nonprofit sector. Right. I mean, there had been an economic impact study of the blueberry industry in California, okay, and not one of the nonprofit community. We did this in conjunction with the University of San Diego with their nonprofit school there, and they did most of the heavy lifting on a lot of the research. And I'm not going to go over this, but I'm just going to show you this slide because I want you to know that we didn't make this up. It's mostly quantitative data from objective sources, including the Department of Labor, the IRS files. We worked directly with a number of counties. For example, there were 2 surveys. One was of California nonprofits with about 2,000 respondents, and one was 2,000 random California residents who speak English. But it is mostly quantitative data. All right, so I'm doing this as a quiz, all right? And usually in a classroom, you know, I'd ask everybody to raise their hands, and of course that's not going to really work here. So you have to think to yourself, what would I answer if I were answering this? All right, so here's the first one. 1 out of how many jobs in California is at a nonprofit? Okay, how many people think it's 1 in 14? How many people think it's 1 in 26? How many people think it's 1 in 39? Got your answer in your head? 1 in 14. 1 in every 14 California jobs is at a nonprofit. And for one thing, that explains why when you go to a family reunion, there's somebody else there who works at a nonprofit. But you know, we tend to think nonprofits are hidden in plain sight, right? So we tend to think of the church, or we think of the homeless shelter, or we think of the theater where we go, or we think about dropping off our daughter at Girl Scouts, and we don't put them all together to realize that 1 in every 14 California jobs is at a nonprofit. In fact, if the staff in California nonprofits were a state, we would be bigger than Delaware. And let me remind you, how many senators does Delaware have? They have 2, okay? And how many senators does California's nonprofit community have? 0, okay? That's why we don't have elected officials, we have to advocate. In fact, by employment, which is the most common way that industry sizes are calculated, the nonprofit sector is California's 4th largest industry. We hire more people than construction, more people than finance, more people than wholesale, more people than real estate, more people than entertainment. And how many times have we heard somebody say something like, we need to do something to create more construction jobs, right? And we want, that's an important sentence. And right after that, we want somebody like each one of you saying, we need to do something to create nonprofit jobs. Now, in addition to this very powerful paid workforce, more than 4.8 million people volunteer in California's communities. In other words, we mobilize this volunteer workforce, which contributes the equivalent of 331,000 full-time workers. Actually, I remember it was an ESC event many years ago where a guy from the Bank of America gave a talk, and he made the point that volunteerism is a huge economic force that is never discussed in economics, in labor, you know, in finance classes or in schools. And I think that's such an important point. And in fact, if you take all the hours together in the nonprofit community, 22% of them are nonprofit, are volunteer hours. So volunteers are not like a little marginal doodad on the outside of volunteer staff hours. Nonprofit volunteer hours and staff hours together are the core way in which we do all of our work. And at every size nonprofit, you know, the 1 or 2 person size nonprofit or the all volunteer nonprofit, as well as the nonprofits that have 800 to 1,000 employees, all of them make use of volunteer hours. But there's some troubling signs in volunteerism, right? Volunteerism in California, we are now in the 15th year of decline in volunteer rates, okay? And you see this middle box here, California is now 47th in volunteering rates. You know, when we in California, we like to think that we're always the best in about everything and everything. And so this is something that we need to be paying attention to. And one of the things, because we're a policy organization, we're working on is this idea of a policy agenda for volunteerism. And if that's something you would be interested in working on with me, please go ahead and send me an email or message me through this session today, okay? Christina, are there any questions or comments so far?
We actually do have a comment that it's such a sad statistic. Do we know any of the reasons behind this this particular statistic?
You mean the one about volunteers?
Yes.
Well, we don't. We can guess. We can guess, but we don't know for sure. I think, you know, one reason, of course, is so many more people are working so many more hours. So many people have to work 2 or 3 jobs, long hours. That may be one reason. We know that when you look at full-time people, people that are working part-time and the people are not working outside of the home, people who are working part-time are the people who are the most likely to volunteer. And we know that overall, California's volunteerism total hours have continued to increase slightly, but that's because the rising population, our actual rates of volunteering are actually going down. And anecdotally, what we know from nonprofits just saying this is that they have more people volunteering. This is pre-virus, okay? That they had more people volunteering, but they wanted to volunteer fewer hours. So for example, one of our board members is the executive director of a museum, and she was saying they have more than ever volunteers, but now they only want to be a docent once a week instead of say 3 or 4 times a week. So we don't know the answer, and we can all guess.
I'm sorry, Jen, do you know how California compares to other states at all on this, or is this a national trend?
Yes, this is a national trend, and you can say that we're doing worse than the bad national trend. If you can see here, we used to be 34th among the 50 states in volunteer rates. We're now 47th. All right, that's It says, right, okay, I compare volunteers to bees. Remember, we used to didn't think that much about bees, right? Bees, bees. Okay, and now I think we've all become more aware of how important bees are in our food chain, right? So many of our crops depend on bees. And I think those of us in the nonprofit staffed sector, we tend to not think as much about volunteerism. And I think just like we have now all learned we need to pay attention to bees, we don't have super solutions yet to bees, but we have woken up about bees. That's where we need to be right now about volunteers. Thanks for that question, by the way.
One more quick question before we move on, and this kind of pertains to the whole presentation. Is someone wondering if we will be able to send a copy of the slides to everyone, and also how can they get a copy of the full report for Causes Count?
Well, I will have a slide towards the end where how you can get it. You can download it for free, or you can order hard copies for $10. And Michelle and Christina, didn't I send you the slides?
Yep.
Okay, so if so, what you can do is you can send them to everybody who registered or who participated in today's session.
Will do. Thank you, Jen.
Mm-hmm.
Great. And then there's one comment, Jan, and this kind of speaks, sorry, I know we got the discussion we wanted. So California nonprofit, this is the comment, California nonprofits do need formal representation in our legislature. There's such a need to advocate for our sector, especially during these times. And this commenter was wondering if Assemblymember Limon's committee is looking at this now.
Thanks for bringing that up. There is, for the first time 3 years ago, which we worked very hard to get, is the Assembly Select Committee on the Nonprofit Sector. And Assemblymember Limon, who's from the Santa Barbara area, chairs that. And it's a bipartisan committee. They're both Republicans and Democrats on it. For example, Assemblymember Marie Waldron, who's from the Escondido area, is a Republican and who's a member of that committee. And yes, they are working at this. And I think that, but it's also interesting, two of the members of that committee also circulated a letter echoing the kind of list of demands that we did. We did a letter of list of demands that more than 1,100 nonprofits signed, and more than 30 legislators also signed that letter, which was done by that committee. So it's very hard for committees to meet right now, but we know that they are working at it. So I don't think if any of you are in Limon's district or any of your assembly members or state senators, it's important to message them and say, this is important. We need help. We have 1 in every 14 California jobs. You need to pay attention to us. Okay, so this is the most important number that we use in Sacramento. Nonprofits bring $40 billion every year into California from out of state. All right, people think of nonprofits as using money within California, but we actually bring $40 billion from out of state. Now, how do we do that? A number of ways. First of all, we bring in federal money. California is a net exporter of taxes. We give more money to the federal government than they give back to us. Nonprofits are an important way in which we leverage bringing that federal money back into California. We get grants from out-of-state foundations like the Gates Foundation or Rockefeller Foundation or other foundations located out of state. And in addition, California nonprofits are recognized all around the world. You can take a nonprofit like, for example, the Sierra Club, which is headquartered in California. They get individual donations from all over the world. So all of these things add up to our bringing dollars into California. And this really changes the dialogue when we talk about it this way. So for example, I was talking to some people in the Central Valley a little while ago, and they were saying, that nonprofits and agribusiness tend to be on opposite sides of things, right? The nonprofits tend to be about healthcare, about farm worker health, and about toxics. And the business tends to be about job growth and the growth of the industry. And they're often kind of in opposition to each other. And if we change that dynamic to thinking about, let's bring millions of dollars from the federal government into the area to build and operate a farm worker clinic, that helps everybody. It brings money into the region. It creates better health care for the workers, makes both business and nonprofits happy, not to mention healthcare, the people that are receiving healthcare, and it brings money and jobs into the community. So when we reframe this from we use money to we bring money into the communities, it makes a very huge difference in how we can able to bring people together to work on a joint project. Okay, now one of these six areas represents the single largest slice of where nonprofit money comes from. In fact, it represents 37% of nonprofit revenue. Now, for this particular statistic, I took out hospitals and universities because, you know, they're kind of outliers, okay? And in the report, every single chart will show you whether it includes hospitals and universities or not, because they tend to make things look different. Okay, so this is another one of these quizzes, okay? How many people think that 37% of nonprofit revenue comes from foundations? How many people think it comes from government? How many people think fees for service? How many people think individuals? How many people think corporations? And how many people think squeeze from stones? Got your answer? Fees for service. Fees for service and program revenue, earned income, represents 37% of our sector's income. Government represents 30%, so not a lot less, but somewhat less. And then individual donations, foundation grants, and corporate grants are lumped together here. Now, we know from other research, not from this particular one, Causes Count, but from other research, that typically that 27% there, foundation grants and corporate grants are each less than 5%, and the remainder is individual donations, including bequests. So it's almost never do people guess fees for service. Lots of times people do say government, and to tell you the truth, government is really a type of fees for service, right? They give us money if we meet certain metrics. You know, so many meals delivered to people through Meals on Wheels, for example. But it is kind of a good question why in our brains, right, so much more attention is paid to individual donations, foundation grants, and corporate grants. And of course, there are lots of nonprofits that live in just one of these slices. You don't have to be in all the slices, but it tells us a lot about where we should be paying more of our attention. And of course, nonprofit subsectors are very different when it comes to business models. Now, if you look at this chart, the kind of light green color, that's earned income or program revenue, fees for service. And then you can see the gray one is government contributions, is kind of a lighter gray. So you can see there's a big difference. Hospitals are 84% earned income. Okay, on the further side, international, 8% is earned income. But what you can also see is that in every single field, everybody has everything. Everybody has a substantial amount of earned income, government money, contributions, and other income. So another way of saying this, we are all hybrid organizations. One other point, so this is meant to show you that government and nonprofits need each other. Now, we often hear people say things like nonprofits depend on government. And it is true that nonprofits rely on government for 30% of our revenue. But the point is, and this graphic is meant to show that, government relies on us. 32% of Medi-Cal services are delivered by nonprofits. In other words, another way of thinking about it is we are part of the supply chain for services. In fact, we kind of are the supply chain for services. When you think about the food supply chain, for example, which we've all learned about more now, you know, there's farms, there's factories, there's truckers, there's wholesalers, there's retailers, right? There's DoorDash, there's all this great continuum that makes up the food chain. And the fact is our services supply chain is largely about nonprofit organizations. Most of the rest of other services come from government directly, not from for-profit service, not from the for-profit sector. So we really need each other. This is a core partnership, not kind of a partnership on the fringe. But anyone who's ever had a government contract, you all know these issues. Payments don't cover the full cost of services. It takes forever to bid. It takes forever to report. They're frequently late. You can have an invoice in and not get it paid for 120 or more days. And another way of putting this list here, this is a big part of our policy agenda. Right. And in fact, what we've done is taken some of these things because they've become so much more urgent in the COVID-19 crisis. So for example, we see nonprofits now all the time that maybe let's say that they have a contract to do a certain number of TB tests. They've turned and they're mostly doing COVID-19 testing, but their contract with the government is for TB tests. So we need government to say, we can swap that out, right? You're already in the budget. We've already given you this much money. If you're doing something that's related to something else, we can move that around more easily. And this is the core of the letter that we sent to the government. Because we are such a core deliverer of services, we need to have the flexibility right now to do the work that we all need to be doing. So let me stop here for a second. And Christina, are there more questions, or Michelle or David?
No, not at this time. But there is, plus the cost of managing those funds was a comment that that came into the chat box.
Well, as a person in the past, I would say years off your lifespan. But more seriously, this is something that we're simply not ever reimbursed for. And you can't really say it as a percentage of contract because to some degree, the amount of time doesn't vary in direct proportion with the size of the contract. But it is not uncommon for 5 to 10 days a month to be spent by somebody simply on reporting because you know, there are counties, and you guys know this, there are counties in California that want to see a paper receipt for something that's under $5, okay? Now, some of them are changing that. Can you imagine it took the COVID-19 crisis to say that you can send a photo of that receipt? But that level of reporting is crazy making, and it requires vast amounts of time. Anyway, I didn't have any gray hairs before I was managing government contracts, and I'm sure that has nothing to do with the fact that I was younger at that time.
Yeah, I do have a comment to add in, Jan, or a point of discussion. The data talking about the fee-for-service being the largest slice of the income for Cal nonprofits, that's also a sobering point of data because currently we know fee-for-service is taking the real hit during the crisis. Locally, we've surveyed Long Beach nonprofits and 66% have had a decrease in services just in the 2 months. And this is a small subsection of the nonprofits in the city, but that equated to $3.7 million just in those 2 months. So we know that this is where the hits are coming, especially hard for nonprofits.
You know what, that is such a good point. And when you think about, there's been so much attention to individual donations and foundation grants, and I think not as many people are paying attention to the fact that nonprofit preschools are not getting tuition, nonprofit theaters and museums aren't getting admission. I mean, that's such an important piece of data to combine with this as a really strong message. Thanks for that point.
And is my understanding correct that these percentages, while they may shift a little bit, have been relatively stable, or are they moving over a period of time?
Well, it depends on the period of time. Over the last 30 years, the biggest change has been the growth in fees for service and program revenue, supplanting individual donations and foundation grants as percentages. In the last, say, 5 years, it's been relatively stable. I think now, of course, we're looking at a big wild card. I would expect to see this whole circle shrink, first of all, get smaller, every single slice getting smaller. And secondly, I think we're going to see some types of organizations getting more government money and some getting less. So, but fees for service, there are some things that that you can pay for and want to pay for remotely, but most things just aren't that way. They're mostly in person. Okay, let me go on to this.
Jan, we had one more question. Can you tell us in which category do faith organizations fall?
I'm sorry.
In which category do faith-based organizations fall?
Faith-based organizations, now I would say that I want to differentiate. So faith-based organizations that are churches and synagogues and temples and houses of worship, okay? They fall into individual donations, right? However, organizations that are affiliated with religious organizations such as Catholic Charities, for example, or Jewish vocational services, those are much more likely to fall into government and fees for service. Lutheran Episcopal services, these are all really important service providers in our communities.
Thank you.
And just, I know you're going to talk about LA County, and I want to let you go ahead. Are these percentages relatively applicable to LA, to the local, as opposed to just the state? Like, do we pretty much echo the state?
You know, LA County is so big, it's hard to describe it as like one county. But the big difference, I'm going to come to disparities in a minute, but the biggest differences are between metropolitan and rural. And part of that is because the foundations are metropolitan based, and so are wealthy people. There are just so many more wealthy people in the metropolitan areas than in rural areas. So in terms of LA County, I would say it depends on which part of the county you're in. It's really different to be in Beverly Hills, for example, which is part of LA County, compared to some other parts. Okay, let me go in here. So this is, you know, this is the last slide on government money. If you've ever tried to look for state funding, you know how crazy it is. Let's say you're looking for mental health funding. You have to look in Health and Human Services, but you may not know, for example, that Fish and Wildlife gets mental health grants, that Juvenile Justice gives mental health grants, right? There are all kinds of mental health grants everywhere, hidden in many different little pockets. And so we sponsored, 2 years ago, we sponsored with Monique Limon a bill which passed with strong support to make one website where every single grant that nonprofits are eligible for will be in one website with a link to how to apply. And it has been mandated to open on July 1. And this is more important than ever because it's going to contain the information about COVID grants from the state and COVID programs. And this is something we've been working with the state library, who is the organization within the government that's in task for creating this. They say they're still on target for July 1, although I'm guessing maybe mid-July would be a better time to start taking a look at it. But this is really about access, and it's one of the advocacy things that we're very proud of. And something that I like to say a lot is, you know, one law is worth 100 foundation proposals. So just a little bit more about our community. So of all the nonprofits in California, less than 2% have expenses over 10 million. Isn't that amazing? So, and 2/3 of us are all volunteer organizations. So we really are a sector of family farms, and we should be proud of being a sector of family farms. You know, when agriculture goes to Sacramento, they put family farms on the stand. We, in fact, are a sector of family farms, but we tend to talk about our biggest institutions and almost ignore or even sometimes look down on all volunteer organizations. And being all volunteer, by the way, is not the same as being small. Just want to remind us that probably the biggest mental health provider in California is an all volunteer organization, and that is, of course, guessing, Alcoholics Anonymous. So all volunteer does not necessarily mean small or low impact, right? Excuse me. So this particular slide talks about foundation grants, and the gold color is California-based foundations to California nonprofits, and then the kind of the orange color is non-California foundations to California nonprofits. So you can see that foundations and grants in general are overwhelmingly about health and education, predominantly higher ed, which is to say colleges and universities. But you can also see, this was really surprising to us, is what really significant amounts of monies come from other states and foundations, and not that many of us think to apply to out-of-state foundations. But you can see in a lot of things that are somewhat surprising, like public safety, for example, there still is really significant money coming from out of state.
Jan,
And
if I could interject just one moment, forgive me. In the chat, we had somebody request the website again. Do you think that you could repeat that out for us from just a few minutes ago? Forgive me. I was managing everything else, and I'm like, oh my goodness. So the chat is in there asking about the website, and someone actually really wants you to lean in a little bit more into the One Law is Worth 100 Foundation proposal statement. They really like that concept.
so first,
Perfect. Thank you.
so first of all, okay, this website has the really, you know, imaginative name called grants.ca.gov. We actually played around with a lot of different phrases like Grants Gateway and Nonprofit Grants Portal, but we decided the URL itself was the right one, grants.ca.gov. And if you're on our mailing list, if you're not on it, you should be on it. And if you are, we have done a number of webinars with the people that are putting together to get nonprofit input on how it's being framed. So stay attention to that. And I just have to say about, you know, one law is worth 100 grant proposals. You know, I remember talking to a woman who was involved with the early founding of women's shelters, battered women's shelters. And, you know, at that time, when women's shelters were being started, it was not against the law to hit your wife. And there was no money for something like a women's shelter. Nobody had even heard of the idea. So they had to convince people that this was something to give money for, but they also had to change the law. And once they changed the law and started to change the way people think about it, then now we have almost all the funding for domestic violence now comes from government, right? And if they had just stayed that course, not argued for a change in the law, they still would be reliant on very small amounts of funding, and we would still have the police coming to the door of a neighbor had called them, and they would be unable to do anything because it wasn't against the law. And they were as frustrated as the domestic violence advocates were. So there are many reasons to support advocacy work, but one of them is simply, it's a business model, right? Advocating for money. I am very proud to say that once I said that when Holly Mitchell, the state senator, was in the room, and she wrote it down and she said, I'm saying that from now on. I said, well, I didn't make it up, I'm afraid, but I still like it. Okay, I want to talk about disparities. Okay, we are such a big state. All right, now who has more money? How many people think Northern California nonprofits? How many people think Southern California nonprofits? How many people think this is why we should be 6 states? Answer, Northern California, right? That line across the state there, that's right at the top of Kern County, and that is the traditional line for dividing Northern and Southern California, because that is approximately where 50% of the population lives north of there and 50% lives south. Northern California nonprofits have about $3,200 for every person who lives in their area, and Southern California nonprofits have $2,300. And so that's why sometimes I like to joke with people in Los Angeles, let's say a homeless shelter in Los Angeles. I sometimes say to them, you know, you've made a strategic mistake in not locating, you know, in Northern California. Of course, they don't really think that's very funny, but Northern California people think it is. And then here's another one. Which nonprofits have more money? Rural nonprofits or metropolitan nonprofits? Poorer communities or wealthier communities? Mostly people of color communities or mostly white communities? And this one's too easy. I'm not going to ask you to vote. Okay, it's metro, wealthier, and white. And here we have, I'm going to go into a little more detail on this, but here's California, and the darker the orange color, the more money that county has. Okay. And so I'm going to just pick some out that might be of particular interest to you. So we're looking here at total nonprofit revenue per resident, not per nonprofit, but per resident. In other words, for a given county, how much do all the nonprofits in that community have per resident to serve those residents? The high is San Francisco at 14,000. The low is Colusa at 97. And that is really, that's just an unbelievable difference. And Los Angeles County is at $2,839. And so This is a call to action. And we lay in the full report, we show that this is this is in every category. This is true for government funding, this is true for foundation funding, and this is true for individual contributions. So it's not just one of those, it's for all areas of funding that some counties get far, far more than other counties.
Jan, we do have a couple questions on that. Is this because of Silicon Valley? Do they give more to nonprofits in Northern California?
So an interesting thing about the Silicon Valley Community Foundation, actually I have a slide on this a little bit later, 95% of the money that they give out is from donor advised funds. It's not at the discretion of the foundation, it's grants made by their donors. And well more than 50%, this is very well documented, leaves the county. So it goes to their alma maters like Harvard, you know, it goes to a lot of things all over the world. So I think that, you know, the foundations make a bigger difference when you look at assets per county than it does in revenue per county.
And does this data include hospitals and universities?
No, it doesn't. It's about hospitals and universities.
Just a few more questions on this one. It seems to spark a few more questions. And actually, this question was from a little bit ago, but do you happen to know why so few foundations support programs for older adults? Do you have any information on that one?
I have not in this study, but I do know what new studies have shown. Okay, one is that for many people in the foundation community, certainly not all, there are some really outstanding funders of senior services, but for many people, funding early childhood, whether it's health or education, feels like an investment. It feels like it's going to pay off over the whole length of that child's life, whereas funding an old person feels like an expense. So this person's last 8 years of their life are better. It doesn't pay off over 50 years. And so that is something that has been cited by a number of foundation people have said that. Surveys have shown that. Another reason is that most people, particularly the young wealthy people, that they have children, and we know that wealthy people, their giving changes quite a bit over their lifetimes. When they're young and they have young children, they're funding pediatric research and they're funding early childhood education. And when they're middle-aged, they fund college scholarships and they fund parks, you know, and so we see that change. And as a lot of sort of the new technology wealth people, their children get a little bit older, we expect to see that change, but it's not changing right now.
Thank you. And then one more question, it actually pertains to this slide. Do you know how Orange County fares in falling of ranking of total nonprofit revenue per resident?
Yes, Orange County is here. Let's see, where are they? Orange County is at 2155 if my eyesight is good enough. So you can see that they're below Los Angeles. I don't have their exact ranking. So what's just a little bit more on Los Angeles County's nonprofit communities. So you can see here, for example, that there are 22,000 nonprofits in LA County, but keep in mind that 2/3 of them, remember, are all volunteer organizations. Our organizations in total employ 425,000 people. Now that does include hospitals and universities. But you know what, and 1.6 million people volunteer in Los Angeles County. So if you look at those two together, we just have an enormous workforce. And so when people talk about jobs, we are jobs, right? And then look at this, our total revenue is $51 billion a year in LA County, but the median revenue is $132,000. So what that median revenue is more likely is closer to being what a typical organization would be. Median means that half of the organizations have more money than that and half of them below. So if we were to look for a synonym that would be typical, this isn't a perfect one, but median is a closer one. And LA County, we mentioned, makes it 12th in the state in terms of nonprofit revenue per capita. So it's definitely, mean, there are 58 counties, so it's definitely better than 57th or 58th, like Calusa. But it is definitely a call to action. It's a call to action to our foundations to be funding in LA County, particularly in the less wealthy parts of LA County. And it's also a call to action for government to say, pay more attention to LA County. There's a population there that is not getting served in the way that it needs to be. And, you know, we in the nonprofit community, we like to think that we work to mitigate disparities and reduce disparities. And actually, the important thing to know is disparities are getting worse. Now, if you look at communities of color, for example, since 2012, nonprofit revenue per capita for organizations based in communities of color grew by 19%, and in white communities it grew by 30%. So the fact is that the disparities are getting worse, they aren't getting better. Despite all the yakety yak about equity, we are in a worse state, and this is also a call to action for all of us. We just can't let these disparities continue to grow. Now, just a few things about foundations and in California. So here we're looking at where foundations in California are located. Now, of course, many foundations give outside their local area, but it still is an indicator about where their staff is, where their kind of immediate attention is focused. So one of the things you can see here that Los Angeles and the Bay Area just dominate both in the number of foundations and in total grant making. Orange, look, is so far behind. Everybody is so far behind those two areas. And these aren't counties, these are areas, so they're a little bit more evenly distributed. But nonetheless, you know, you can see that 54% of assets and 36% of assets, that's 90% of foundation assets are in either the Bay Area or Los Angeles. This is why, for example, when we give a presentation like this to someplace on the Central Coast, like San Luis Obispo, or in Crescent City, for example, in the far north, we hardly even bother to talk about foundations. There aren't any, and people aren't interested in them because there just aren't any. And looking at the top 25 California foundations that fund California nonprofits, you can see that the top 25 granted 81% of the foundation dollars, right? So this is also kind of a very top heavy sector, looking at the top 25. And if you, there's more information in the full report. For example, I don't think I put it in here. I did actually, the top 25 out-of-state foundations awarding grants to California nonprofits. It's really interesting to see. The Gates Foundation, located in Washington, they gave more than $306 million to nonprofit organizations in California. So again, I think more of us need to be thinking about approaching out-of-state foundations than we have been. Right. This is just a point about donor advised funds. Donor advised funds tend to throw off statistics. So, for example, if you look in the right-hand square, there are now only 157 California-based nonprofits that say that they hold donor advised funds, but they hold $4.5 billion. They receive $4.5 billion a year, all right? So only 157 donor advised fund sponsors, but really a large amount of income. And just one example, probably the best known outside, you know, the Wall Street firms are, of course, Schwab, Vanguard, and Fidelity. Fidelity now receive, because its donor advised funds now receive more revenue per year than any nonprofit in the United States. But just taking a look at one, Silicon Valley Community Foundation, their total grants, $1.8 billion, which first starts, like if you're not in Silicon Valley, you might think, my gosh, that's such a huge amount of money. It's important to remember that 95% of those grants were made from their donor advised funds, not at the discretion or decision under the decision making of the foundation. So that's important amounts of money and grants, but it also represents, you know, it's more like individual giving. You solicit them through individual donors, not through the foundation. So these just donor advised funds tend to kind of throw off some of the numbers. And I think a lot of you know, we've been doing a lot of policy work about donor advised funds lately. Just a word about diversity in nonprofits. So the fact is that in workers, management positions, and boards, California nonprofits are much more diverse in race and gender. So for example, women represent 63% of the nonprofit workforce. In overall workforce, 45%. People of color, it's pretty close actually, 31% are people of color in nonprofits, and in the overall workforce, 28%. But the differences are really stark in boards of directors. So women represent 56% of board members in nonprofits and only 23% in Fortune 500 companies. People of color are 27% on nonprofit boards and 16% in for-profits. And so one of the things to do is you can also use these kinds of numbers as thinking, you know, so given these averages, you know, how does our nonprofit stand? And how do we think about that? And then in staff leadership, which we defined here as a member of the management team, however you choose to define the management team, nonprofit and women, for women, nonprofit represent 73% of nonprofit management team members, and people of color represent 29%, and you can see that those are both a lot higher, more than twice as high than those kinds of same leadership issues in the for-profit community. So I'm going to stop here and see if there are any questions again.
There was a question related to, I know you commented on the work you're doing around donor advised funds. One of the questions was, is it true that donor advised funds do not require mandatory annual payouts? If that's true, what, if anything, can be done to alter this? So it may be a good spot, unless it's later on in the presentation, to talk about that work.
Yes, it is true. There is no required payout. Now, private foundations are required to give an average of 5% of their assets each year. And if they don't do that, they have to pay a fine. But donor advised funds don't have to give out anything ever. And this is definitely an area of great controversy and policy controversy. And I don't want to get into it here because I know that it's very sharp disagreements within the nonprofit sector about it, and it's a great topic, and I love talking about it, but this probably isn't the right time for it.
Thank you.
Okay. Oh, so, you know, oh, here one. All right. So, you know, a lot of times we hear people say in nonprofits say things like, you know, if only people understood nonprofits, they just don't understand us. If they understood us, they would like us. And if they liked us, they would give us more money. And here's the news. They already really, really like us. Okay. And so this was that study I mentioned of a survey of 2,000 randomly selected California residents, although we did only survey people who speak English, right? And one of the points, so you can see here that the gold bar is nonprofits, the green is for-profits, and the gray is government. And you can see here that more people think that we create jobs than for-profits create, more people than people that think for-profits create jobs. They think we work more efficiently, that we're more efficient than others. We act ethically and we promote social change. Now, we thought we knew those two, okay? But the fact is that the public knows that we create jobs, we do a better job of creating jobs and of being efficient than either government or the for-profit sector. And so we should claim this, and we should say, we should come from a point of view of thinking that it doesn't matter whether people understand us, they like us, and they respect us. Now, you know, I have relatives who are farmers, and, you know, farmers are always saying something similar, which is people just understood farming, you know, but, you know, the fact is we're never going to understand farming. We're never going to understand construction. We're never going to understand hedge funds. You know, our society is now so complex that we have a trouble understanding big things like these. And so, you know, I don't even know how my cell phone works, right? So I think the thing to keep in mind is that we are in a position of strength with the public opinion of us, and we should lead with that. Because, of course, we're a public policy advocacy organization, we wanted to know about how nonprofits work in policy. This was really surprising. Within the last 12 months, 76% of nonprofits said they had met with public officials or their staff. And 53% said that they belong to a coalition that lobbies, whether it's, for example, California Association of Nonprofits or our organization, It could be a local organization. It could be the California Association of Food Banks or the California Association of Museums, for example. But these are pretty high numbers. And of course, when you ask nonprofits, do you lobby? A lot of times people say no, but because they're not counting the fact that, oh yeah, I did go meet with the head of Health and Human Services 3 weeks ago to talk about how they're going to be distributing funding around people in transition out of foster care, right? So the fact is we are all the time in contact with government. And I wish that this were higher, encourage constituents to vote. Voting is one of the most important things that we're able to encourage people to do. And it matters who's in office, and it matters what ballot propositions fail and which ones succeed. So this year, voting is going to be more important than ever. Yeah, Christina.
Yeah, so this actually is perfect timing for a question that was posed in our Q&A. And it echoes some of what's on the slide here, but the question is, why are lawmakers, even local lawmakers, not taking us as a sector seriously? We are an important employer by sector. So do you have some recommendations of how we can maybe shift that view?
Well, first of all, okay, I do have a slide on this, but one of the things we can do that all of us can do is that we can always, so the simplest thing is that I mentioned earlier, anytime anybody hears somebody say what is being done to raise construction jobs or to support the construction industry, every one of us should be saying, what is being doing to support nonprofits where one out of every 14 jobs is at a nonprofit, right? Anytime you hear somebody say, nonprofits cost so much money, say nonprofits bring $40 billion a year into California from out of state. And anytime you hear anybody say, you'll hear an idea posed, and somebody is often likely to say, I wonder what the chamber has to say about that. I wonder what small business would say about that. You have to raise your hand and say, I wonder what the nonprofit sector thinks about that, right? Because we are the economy. We are not on the fringes of the economy. We are the economy. Somebody in government asked us a couple of weeks ago, what can nonprofits do to help in the recovery? And we said, helping nonprofits is helping the recovery, right? So I think part of it, I have to say, this sounds just so, everything I can't stand, but we have to have better self-esteem. Okay, we can't go into these meetings thinking, oh, poor us, we have no power. 76% are meeting every year with public officials. Okay, we're a huge part of the economy. We are the services supply chain. So you have to give yourself, why haven't women been taken seriously? We still don't really know the full answer to that. So I don't think we're necessarily going to know the full answer to this, but we can all start by changing the culture. Never let anybody say in your presence something that's demeaning about nonprofits. Never let that happen.
Thank you so much for that. We do have a couple more questions in the Q&A, but I think that you might get to them in the next couple slides. So we'll see about that. And then I know that we will have time to ask these questions towards the end.
Okay. So just a couple quick things about changes since our last report. So I mentioned the disparity is getting worse between people of color communities and predominantly white communities. It's also worse for rural and metro. In 2012, for every dollar that a metropolitan nonprofit had, a rural nonprofit had 61 cents. Now they have 59 cents. Now, before the COVID virus, we could know that nonprofit wages were up 23% and statewide wages were 25%. So we do know this, and we just got a really interesting report that some folks at an economic impact firm did for us for free. And it shows that actually in the last 2 recessions, nonprofits have lost far fewer jobs than for-profits have lost, and that nonprofit wages are more stable in a recession than for-profits. So we know that what this shows is in an economic uptick, wages grow faster and the number of jobs grow faster in for-profit companies, but in a recession, wages are more stable and the number of jobs are more stable in nonprofit organizations. Foundation assets have grown, and also we're seeing a shrinking of the middle class, and this is very worrisome to us. You know how we know in society, right, that the old model was something like, very few poor people, very few wealthy people, and a really large middle class. And we're seeing now kind of a barbell laid on its side, really a lot of poor people, a lot more rich people, and a lot fewer people in the middle class. And this is happening to the nonprofit community as well. Our largest nonprofits are getting bigger. We continue to have a lot of small nonprofits. We're having fewer and fewer middle class nonprofits. And this is worrisome because every delivery system needs to have an ecosystem. So you can never have one theater and have it be brilliant, right? Theater depends on having some volunteer theaters, some equity theaters, a whole kind of series of theaters, right? To have a theater ecosystem is what makes for great theaters. That's also true about childcare. That's true about immigrant legal services. That's true about everything. So the fact that we may be losing some of our middle class strength in the community is something that we all, particularly foundation funders, should be concerned about, because it's about nurturing the ecosystem, not just picking out a few stars. Okay, and so this is kind of our last slide, and this is the point I was making. Anytime you hear anybody say, what does business think? Say, what do nonprofits think? And this is our job at Cal Nonprofits, because we know if we get nonprofits to the table, we will say the most important, most compelling things, but we need to get to the table. So we all need to get ourselves, and we need to get other people to the table. And I think so, for example, every time that you talk to a government official, every time that you talk to a foundation, tell them something good about another nonprofit, not just yours, all right? Tell them something good about a nonprofit in a rural area, in a poor area, in a community of color, because what that does is somebody else can often get people to the table more than we can get ourselves to the table. So we all need to do that, is to get other people, to get our advocates to the table, because that's the issue. We know once we get there, we're very powerful. In the last recession, there were huge numbers of benefits to business that nonprofits were excluded from. In this coming recession, or this recession we're already in, I should say, because of the years of work from nonprofit advocates, nonprofits have been included in almost every single relief measure for for-profits, like the Paycheck Protection Program, right, which is extended to both nonprofits and for-nonprofits. Okay, here's the thing about how to find out, get more stuff. And I just have a couple of policy notes because they asked me to do that. So actually, before we do that, Christina, are there any more questions on the causes count part of this?
Actually, just a question. And this pertains to the foundations. We know that the assets of the foundations has grown, but has the concentration, this is a little bit of a long question, so if you want to pull it up in Q&A, you can too, but has the concentration of resources grown narrower over time among that group of foundations that own most of the sector, or has the share of foundations involved in the largest amount of giving in the state grown?
Say that last sentence again.
So it has the share of foundations involved in the largest amount of giving in the state grown?
Sorry. As share, yes. And the reason for that is because the new foundations are so large, right? So the new foundations, it used to be that $50 million was a big foundation. And now it's not because of tech money. So you see, people who are the people at the big tech companies, you see them starting, this is a few years ago now, but I was once invited to observe at a party that was the requirements for which you had to be under 35 years old and worth more than 200 million. And, there were about 300 people at that party, right? So we didn't used to have that kind of wealth, and so now we do, and so now the size of foundations has gotten a lot larger of new foundations. And I also think some of the very largest foundations have, because they're tended to be older, they tend to be old money, not new money. They're like, Packard Foundation, the Irvine Foundation, they tend to, they tend to be more intentional about their giving in terms of typically larger regions. For example, a new foundation is more likely to be funding very locally.
And then going back to some of the data, can you unpack a little bit the growing disparities among organizations by race?
Organizations by what?
By race. If you can reiterate or unpack the growing disparities among NGOs by race.
No, we can't do that. We can do it by county, but not by race. We were using, we could if we went back into the data. We did it by zip code and using zip code race data. And one of the things that is important to remember that, even within a zip code, there can be a lot of disparities. So it's kind of a little bit of a broad stroke, and that would be a great thing to do, though. I would love to do that if we have a little bit more money to go back and dive in, because that data was very expensive to get. We could go back and look at it. I love that idea.
Thank you, Jan. And then these next questions are a little bit related, and you may be answering it in your next couple slides, but I kind of wanted to pop these to you now. If you have any sense of the type of pivots foundations might make in the next few years, or have you heard of any major initiative shifts coming down the pike?
Well, I feel like almost every entity has started a COVID-19 relief fund. Every community foundation has started one, practically every company has started one, Rotary clubs have started one, everybody has started a COVID-19 relief fund, and they're all talking about how much money they've raised for it. And I want them to talk about how much money they've given out. That would be the first thing. I think that we are a large foundation actually phoned me yesterday and said, what are nonprofits going to need as they reopen? Do they need better technology? Do they need some HR training? What are they going to need? So I think we're starting to see people think about that. I do think that the most interesting thing to me is that many foundations have acted very quickly in the COVID crisis. They have changed some of them have changed their grants from restricted to unrestricted. Some of them have made new grants that are unrestricted. And I have to say that faster grant making and unrestricted grants are the things that we have been only asking for the last 100 years, right? So I think that one of the big differences between nonprofits and foundations is that there's a sense of urgency in nonprofits, right? You have 5 families there that are about to get deported, right? You have a great sense of urgency. Foundations don't have that, right? They're looking to exist in perpetuity, so they're looking very long time frames. So in the COVID-19 crisis, everything has become urgent for everybody. And I think that's the biggest change that we've seen in foundations, is that they have found themselves with the same sense of urgency that so many nonprofits have all the time. So I think what we'll want to see is, are they going to keep that sense of urgency, or are they going to go back to thinking much longer term and towards preserving their portfolios? In the last recession, what we saw was, because foundation portfolios shrank so much, right? Because their stock value had shrunk so much, we saw hundreds of foundations giving less money and even taking back grants in some cases. I remember having a grant taken back from a very large Bay Area private foundation at that time, for example. So I think it's too early to know, but I think we do see foundations really stepping up in ways that we just hope and pray are going to be continued new ways of thinking, and not just kind of a blip on the radar. I also think that, all of our attention right now has tended to be on emergency services. And I think that our nonprofit arts organizations, our humanities organizations, our music organizations, our environmental organizations, it's still important for arts are what heal people. Arts are about community and what people seek in every society. We still need to work on having fresh water for everybody. So those concerns can't go away either. As emergency funds funding may drop, we can't forget about these other things as well.
I think your sentiment echoed just a statement that came in as you were talking about all of the relief funding coming down the pike, that may mean that there's less funding available for the next 5 years for their, the traditional types of activities that they would fund, the arts or health or other issues. So definitely something that people are already worried about and kind of thinking about. A couple more questions that we did have on here. Do you have any idea, or is the data leading you in a certain way of seeing how COVID may affect our employment rates going forward within the nonprofit sector? Is there anything that helps us figure out a little bit about that?
Employment is going to plummet in all but emergency services. I was talking the other day to a woman who runs an after-school program. They have 400 employees. They've laid off 123 of them. They're expecting to lay off more. They used to have, she said, we used to have 100 kids in a gymnasium. Can't do that. People in the arts, they can't open there are 1,500 museums in California. Every single one of them is closed. That means that they don't have any admissions, no admissions fees. Lots of people had galas planned, for example, fundraising events, a walkathon or a dinner or something planned. And a lot of people that had those scheduled, people bought tickets before the virus. A lot of those people are willing to turn their tickets into donations. But it's really unclear that they would buy a $150 ticket in the future to something that doesn't happen. So the fact is that except in emergency services that are government funded, we're probably going to see a serious drop in employment everywhere. But it's not going to be as serious as it is in the for-profit sector. That doesn't help you very much if you're laying people off or if you're laid off. But that is something to keep in mind.
We did have a question, and this person originally thought that they heard that there were over 35,000 nonprofits in the LA region, and they see now the numbers 22,000 plus. Has the number shrunk over the years, or was that just a previously incorrect number? Do you have any information on that?
The number, it should be so easy. It's just like, why can't you just count everybody in the country in the census? It's kind of a problem. One of the reasons why the numbers have dramatically dropped, okay, is because what happened was, so it used to be that a nonprofit would become a nonprofit, let's say in 1959, and then they went dormant. Okay, and there was never a reason for them to disband, so they never disbanded. So they have not done anything since 1959. The people who started it in 1959 have forgotten that it even existed. They're still on the books. Okay, now 7 years ago, I believe it was, there was a law passed that said that if you don't do a single thing for 3 years, we're going to start proceedings to drop you. Okay, so what we have seen is tens of thousands of nonprofits in the last 5 years disappear, but they haven't really disappeared. They were beyond life support, right? You can't even say they were on life support. So I think if you start looking, maybe 5 years ago was really the first time we're seeing numbers that talk about active nonprofits. And to stay active, you have to submit, I call it the proof of life postcard. You have to mail in a postcard once a year. And if you're a California nonprofit, you can go to the Attorney General's website at any time, type in your nonprofit ID number, and it will tell you what forms you're late on. And let me just tell you that we hear this all the time from people that they're late on a form and they didn't realize it because they didn't file it 6 years ago and nobody noticed. So it's worth doing it. Okay, I know we're almost out of time, so I just want to say something really quickly about California policy work. And for people on the arts, I saw there are quite a few people on the arts on this call. We work really closely with Californians for the Arts, and they are doing a terrific job. As is the California Association of Museums and the California Association of Symphony Orchestra and the California Alliance for, I can't remember the exact name, but it's for people in arts education. So these arts coalitions are extremely important to be a part of. But just people know that there are new benefits for employers. Actually, at 12 o'clock, just a few minutes ago, the governor started his speech talking about what his revised budget's going to look like for this year. So from the time we've started till now, probably things look a lot worse for nonprofits based on that. But I think the nonprofit partnership and the capacity building alliance members and other people have done a good job of letting people know what kinds of government benefits there are going to be for California nonprofits. And just a reminder that government nonprofits the government has the ability to help people to just such a far greater rate than the private sector, including foundations, can. So, if you consider, for example, just one thing, the Paycheck Protection Program, right, which is literally billions of dollars to nonprofits, you would never get a foundation grant for that kind of amount of money. And so, or very seldom. So it's just important to remember that advocating for COVID-19 and other kinds of supports is super important now. Our two biggest priorities for what we think nonprofits are more specifically, one is flexibility in contracts with government, and the second one is equal treatment and relief for nonprofits and for-profits when they're employers or when they're commercial tenants. So for example, the issue of there has been, for example, eviction moratoriums for for-profit small businesses, and we advocated for and just got a eviction moratorium for nonprofits that are also small too. So commercial tenant protection does need to be the same for nonprofits and for-profits. Okay, I'm sorry, Michelle and Christina, we're so far out of time, but what time is it? It's like 10:56 or something like that. So
you are doing great on time. This has been fantastic.
Okay, good. Oh wait, okay. So this is some of the COVID-19 advocacy work that we're doing right now. Okay, so are there any questions? Or I mean, I really love to hear David and Michelle and Christina. I would really love to have what reflections that you may have after hearing this kind of dumping just piles of kind of data on your heads.
Overall, I know that everybody's going to say how fantastic this has been. So I'm only the first of a cast of thousands that will say that. So informative. I've got pages of notes and things to talk about with my staff and all. On the advocacy, and I don't want to put you on the spot, so I'm asking a question, but you answer it however you want. Can you talk about the receptivity of our local political leaders to the nonprofit sector's needs that would maybe guide some of us in the conversations on behalf of the sector we'd like to have?
I don't know who the local leaders are necessarily, so it's hard for me to know. I do know that two of the county supervisors in LA County both have very strong nonprofit backgrounds, which always makes them more receptive. But I don't know the county and city folks.
And I just want to thank you, Jan, again. I think that a lot of the points you're bringing up, and David, I know this is where our conversations have been as part of the Capacity Builder Network, is what are our points of advocacy? And even this morning we had a call with some other nonprofits. I think that Cal Nonprofits sets a great example and a guide to what policy is out there that we can then look at our local level to see how we can work together to advocate for things that are coming down. And we know that there's a lot of federal and local level dollars that are going to start coming into our cities and counties. And so there's nonprofits on this call in all different cities and potentially in different counties. I know we had an Orange County question too. So paying attention to how that money is trickling down into your local governments, and also then asking questions about how they're making decisions on that. So in Long Beach and in the county, the CBN is looking countywide where we can help to drive that conversation. But in Long Beach, TNP is also gathering that from nonprofits, and we're gathering data and storytelling. So I think wherever there's a coalition or a collaboration that you can work with, I think that's the best way for us to collaborate right now.
I think one other thing, it's actually a lot easier to go to a hearing these days. Before you'd have to go to the county board of supervisors meeting or the city council meeting and like, where am I going to park? You know what I mean? And what about the traffic? And so one of the things, it's actually easier to go to hearing now. So one of the things, if you have somebody who says, I want to virtually volunteer for you, one of the things you could suggest is something like, well, would you watch the Board of Supervisors Committee on Economic Development hearings and let us know what's happening in them? And then if there is a hearing, you might look at the agenda every time there's a meeting and see if there's some place that we should be speaking out at. And now again, of course, you can, play solitaire on your phone while you're watching this incredibly boring thing on your computer screen and wait for your item to be called. And then, it's just a lot easier now to get 10 parents to be at that meeting and to say, hey, in public comment, right, to say something like, I don't know what the solution is, but we need childcare.
I love the secrets of the trade, that play solitaire on your phone until it's your time. That's peeling the curtain back on how excellent lobbying is done. One point that you said that I want to underscore, if that's all right, is you said when you're talking to an elected official or somebody of any influence, remember to bring other nonprofits into the conversation. As capacity builders, our success is through the success of the nonprofits we work with. And I've found in all my conversations that just what you said is really powerful when you say it's not just about help me, which of course I'd like you to help me as a nonprofit, but think about the arts organizations we're working with, or think about, I know we have a cohort of domestic violence organizations. Think about my fellow organizations in domestic violence and what we're trying to do. And I really appreciated your making that point and thought it was worth underscoring.
Yeah.
I was talking to somebody from a large Hispanic organization, and one of the people that they had contacted with was a Latino football player. He was a quarterback. And he said, what can I do to help? And they said, this is the only thing we need you to do. Every single press conference, say the name of our organization. And I just thought, all of us, we're not, quarterbacks, but we can all do that.
Thank you, Jan. And I know we're coming up, we're such good on time now. We're just 1 minute away. So I want to thank you with the time we have left. Thank David for your insights and supporting this collaboration. And if there's any questions that didn't get answered, we can send those to Jan and get those answered as well, if we can't answer them ourselves. But I want to thank everyone for staying on and joining us today. And we've provided some information and contact information in the chat. If you haven't grabbed that, you still have time to do that. And Cal Nonprofits is an amazing organization. So if you're not on their mailing list, they're sending out a lot of that policy information that you can take down to your local level. It's a great guide to take and write your own letters or share your own, work that into how you're advocating for yourself in the sector. So we encourage everyone to join, or at least visit the website and join the mailing list so you can get all of those updates. And there's a lot of great information there. So thank you, Jan. Thank you, Capacity Builder Networks at David. And thank you everyone for joining us, and have a great rest of your week. It's almost the weekend.